Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am happy to rise and speak against the Public Sector Employer Amendment Act. I certainly hope that after the hour that's allocated to this debate that we'll be able to hear some arguments and that the members on the other side will perhaps come to their senses on this bill and that we will vote against this bill. You know, one might have to ask when we're talking about the compensation for boards and commissions of, again, with so many of the other bills that we have talked about this evening, of what the justification was. Again, we've heard so many of my colleagues on this side of the aisle ask, you know, when you're out talking with your constituents, the typical Albertans, when you're in the shops, is this something that you hear people coming to you saying, wow, you know what we really need to do in this province is change the compensation for people on boards and commissions? This isn't what I'm hearing from people when I'm out in the community, asking them what's important to them. I think you've heard me speak already a couple of times about what really is important to the people in my constituency, because I've already risen to speak a few times about the need for schools. Yeah. I think I've already talked a few times about how so many parents that I have spoken to about the challenges that they face in getting their kids into a school that is crowded, that doesn't have the teachers required to teach the number of kids in that school. But we have already heard from this government that that's not a particular concern to them, having voted down our private members' bill that would ask them to report on class sizes and make sure that we have the proper number of teachers and educational assistants there for those schools. I certainly hear from my constituents about their need for health care and access to health care. I'm going to honestly say that when I was door knocking and campaigning, where I really started to learn about how personal politics can be and the deeply personal, emotional stories that people were sharing about healthcare. Yeah. Nobody was sharing with me deeply personal, emotional stories about the need for higher salaries on boards and commissions. Yeah. I will say one interesting thing, though, about these boards and commissions and, you know, who has the ability to appoint the members of these boards and commissions. And I'll share a story. I'm not going to disclose any names, but you've also heard on this side of the aisle, my colleagues, you know, talk about, you know, like who's naming people to these boards and commissions? Is it their friends that are on these boards and commissions? I will say, interestingly, you know, like somebody that I know pretty well, who, you know, skirted around, even though a dear friend of mine, a supporter of our party, donated to our party in 2019. And after the government of the day found out that she had donated to the NDP, she was removed from her seat on one of these boards and commissions. Wow. So it's bad. Now, knowing that we're appointing our friends to these boards and commissions, the argument has been made about the need for these salaries to be flexible in attracting people to work in these positions. And I think you've also, you know, heard earlier on other bills the understanding of the needs out there to attract talent into our province. You did see on this side of the House vote in favour of Bill 7, knowing that we needed to make a move to attract talent into our tech sector. So I think it is understood that we can wrap our heads around, you know, what's needed to attract the necessary talent into our province. But, you know, given the blanketed nature of who this applies to, you might have to wonder, do we need that flexibility to attract people to be on the board of the Agricultural Financial Services Corporation? You might be able to say, talk us into the argument of a post-secondary institution, even though we're not necessarily going to buy that either. But why did this have to apply across the board when maybe it wasn't necessary to be applied across the board? And when we think about, not just that we're appointing friends to be on these boards and commissions, but, let's talk about the fact that, a lot of people who are on these boards and commissions are retirees. They are professional board members. That there probably isn't the requirement for these people to be realizing these salary gains. And so I think, and of course my screen has died. So my talking notes all disappeared.
Okay, there they are.
And so, another thing that I'd also like to bring forward is that we know that this is kind of like a pulling back of legislation that the NDP put in place to put some controls around this when we were in government. So it feels a little bit like we're stepping back into that, summer of repeals that we went through with Jason Kenney. I guess one of the other things I'd like to ask or muse about is this bill coming from, ostensibly a Conservative Party, being named the United Conservative Party. I would think that a Conservative Party would be thinking about fiscal responsibility.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering why a government that ostensibly would be thinking about fiscal responsibility would be opening the door for ballooning salaries on boards and commissions across the province. Potentially, how many roles are we talking about? Hundreds? If every single one of those was increasing only by 10% or 20%, how much money are we talking about? And is that responsible for a Conservative government to be spending this money in, frankly, quite an irresponsible way, when these funds could be directed towards, say, teachers, educational assistants, nurses, doctors? Isn't that where we should really be thinking about salaries that are being earned and the benefits that are provided to our society and what Albertans are really asking for? And I think if that were our question, I think we would change our mind and that we would say no to Bill 5, which is what I encourage all members on each side of the House to do. Thank you.
Yeah.